My name is Anna, and I am 30 years old now, but this story began long before I knew how to name what I was missing. I forgave my mother on a quiet afternoon when nothing special was supposed to happen. No raised voices, no dramatic confessions. Just a small kitchen table and a cup of tea that slowly lost its warmth. She sat across from me, her back straight, her hands folded the way they always were. Careful, controlled. As if she was still afraid of taking up too much space in the room. When she said she was sorry, her voice did not break. It was steady, practiced, almost polite. The kind of apology that comes after years of thinking, not after a sudden rush of emotion. "I did the best I knew how," she said. "I know it wasn't enough." I nodded. I reached for my cup. I felt calm. That calm surprised me more than her apology. I had imagined this moment many times before. In my imagination, I cried. She cried. We reached across the table. Something old and heavy finally lifted. But none of that happened. I believed her. I truly did. I forgave her in that moment without forcing myself to. The forgiveness was real. And yet, when I left her house later that day, the space between us walked out with me. It sat quietly in the passenger seat as I drove home. It did not accuse. It did not demand. It simply existed, the way it always had. That was when I understood something I had never allowed myself to think before. Forgiveness does not always bring closeness back. Sometimes it only brings peace. And sometimes, peace still comes with distance. This is not a story about anger. It is not about a mother who meant harm or a daughter who refused to let go. It is a story about love that was shaped by fear, silence, and generations of restraint. It is the story of how I learned to forgive my mother. And how I learned to accept that some spaces remain, even after forgiveness. I grew up in a house where everything had a place and stayed there. Shoes lined neatly by the door. Coats hung in the same order every winter. The living room looked untouched even after we had lived in it for years. My mother liked things clean and quiet. She believed order made life easier. She believed chaos led to disappointment. As a child, I learned to move softly through that house. I learned which floorboards creaked. I learned how to close doors without making a sound. Noise felt like a mistake. My mother was not cold in the way people often imagine. She smiled at neighbors. She volunteered at school events. She remembered birthdays and appointments. From the outside, she looked like a devoted parent, and in many ways she was, but affection was measured, carefully controlled, given in small, safe amounts. She kissed me goodnight every evening. One kiss, quick, predictable. Hugs were brief and usually happened in public when people were watching. At home, they felt unnecessary. She believed children needed structure more than comfort. She believed too much affection made people weak. She never said those words directly, but they lived in the way she raised me. I learned early how to need less. When I fell and scraped my knee, I wiped the blood away before going inside. When I felt scared at night, I counted the seconds until sleep came. When I felt lonely, I told myself it would pass. My mother did not ignore me. She simply expected me to handle things on my own. "You're strong," she would say. "You'll be fine." Those words became both a compliment and a burden. At school, teachers praised me for being quiet and responsible. Friends, parents said I was easy to have around. I smiled. I behaved. I never caused trouble. Inside, I carried questions I never asked. Why didn't she sit beside me when I cried? Why did comfort feel like something I had to earn? Why did love feel so careful? I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself every family was different, and maybe they were. The first time I noticed something was missing, I was 8 years old. I was at a friend's house after school. Her mother greeted her at the door and pulled her into a long hug. She brushed her hair back and asked about her day, not just what she did, but how she felt. I stood there holding my backpack, unsure where to look. The warmth in that room felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. On the way home, I wondered what it would feel like to be held that way. I wondered if I would like it, or if it would feel strange. That night, my mother asked if I had finished my homework. She reminded me to brush my teeth. She kissed my forehead and turned off the light. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the house breathe around me. My mother did love me, I know that now. She showed it through actions. Through responsibility, through sacrifice. She worked hard. She kept us safe. She made sure we had what we needed. But love without words can feel invisible to a child. I didn't know how to explain what I felt, so I learned to explain nothing. When people asked if my mother and I were close, I said yes. It seemed easier than trying to define something so quiet and complicated. We never fought loudly. We never slammed doors. We never shouted across rooms. Our distance was polite, almost graceful. As I grew older, the silence between us grew heavier. Teenage years are full of emotions that do not sit still. Fear, hope, confusion, I felt them all deeply, but I shared none of them. My mother noticed changes in behavior, not feelings. She commented on grades, on posture, on responsibilities. She did not ask about heartbreak. She did not ask about doubts. Once, after a long day at school, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing. She noticed. "What's wrong?" she asked. I opened my mouth, then I closed it. "Nothing," I said. She nodded and went back to washing dishes. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. When it was time for me to leave home, my mother helped me pack. She folded my clothes neatly. She labeled boxes in clear handwriting. She reminded me to be careful. She did not cry. At the door, she hugged me once. Firm, brief. "Call me when you arrive," she said. I promised I would. As I drove away, I felt something I couldn't name. Not sadness exactly, not relief either. It felt like continuation, like I was carrying the distance with me into a new place. Adult life has a way of bringing old questions back. I struggled sometimes. I doubted myself. I felt lost more often than I admitted. I called my mother when things became too heavy. She listened. She offered solutions. She reminded me to stay strong. "You always manage," she said, and I did. But part of me wished, just once, she would say, "That sounds hard." When I became a mother myself, everything changed. Holding my child for the first time, I felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost scared me. Love rushed in without asking permission. I understood, in that moment, how deep connection could feel. And I understood something else too. My mother had never learned this language. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought sadness and understanding. Looking back now, I see how the distance formed slowly. Not from neglect, not from cruelty, but from fear, from habit, from generations of believing love should be quiet. By the time my mother apologized, the distance had already lived between us for decades. Forgiveness was never the problem. Letting go of expectations was. In the next part, I will tell you how that distance began to press against my adult life, how marriage and motherhood made it impossible to ignore, and how small moments began to crack the calm surface we had both worked so hard to keep. People often say that relationships with parents get easier as you grow older. That distance fades. That understanding naturally brings closeness. For me, adulthood did not soften the space between my mother and me. It made it clearer. As a child, I did not have the language to describe what I felt. As an adult, I finally did, and once I could name it, I could no longer ignore it. The distance was not loud. It did not demand attention. It waited patiently, showing itself in quiet moments. Phone calls that stayed short, visits that felt polite instead of warm, conversations that circled around real feelings without touching them. I told myself this was just how we were. I told myself not to compare, but comparison has a way of finding you anyway. When I moved further into adulthood, my calls with my mother followed a familiar pattern. She asked about work. She asked about schedules. She asked about practical matters. I answered. I listened. I agreed. There were pauses sometimes, moments where something else could have been said. Neither of us filled them. If I mentioned stress, she offered advice. If I mentioned fear, she offered reassurance that sounded like instruction. "You'll manage," she said. "You always do." She was proud of my strength, I knew that. But sometimes I did not want to be strong. I wanted to be understood. When I met the family of the man I would later marry, I felt something unfamiliar. Warmth. His mother hugged freely. She laughed loudly. She asked questions that didn't have quick answers. "How are you really?" she asked once, looking straight at me. I froze for a moment. Then I smiled and gave a safe answer. "I'm fine." She nodded, but her eyes stayed soft. As if she knew there was more. At their dinner table, people spoke openly. They teased each other. They disagreed and then moved on. Affection was not measured there. It flowed easily. I felt grateful and strangely sad. Marriage has a way of holding up a mirror to your inner life. My husband noticed things I had never questioned. Why I apologized so quickly. Why I downplayed my feelings. Why I struggled to ask for help. One evening, after a visit with my parents, he said gently, "Your mom doesn't really listen to you, does she?" The question caught me off guard. "She listens," I said. "She just shows it differently." He nodded, not arguing, but the question stayed with me. When I became pregnant, emotions rose to the surface in ways I couldn't control. Fear sat beside excitement. Hope lived next to doubt. I called my mother often during that time. She gave advice about routines, about safety, about what to expect. She did not ask how afraid I was. Once I tried to tell her. "I'm scared I won't be a good mother," I said quietly. There was a pause. "You'll do fine," she replied. "Just be consistent." The call ended shortly after. I sat there holding my phone, feeling foolish for expecting more. When my child was born, love arrived all at once. It was overwhelming, protective, tender. I held my baby and felt a deep need to comfort, to soothe, to stay close. I wondered what my mother had felt when she held me. Did she feel this too, or had fear already built walls inside her? I watched myself instinctively do things she never did. Lingering hugs, soft words, gentle reassurance, not because she was wrong, but because I needed to do it differently. Motherhood changed the way I saw my own mother. I noticed her discomfort with strong emotions, her quick attempts to fix instead of feel. When my child cried loudly, my mother tensed. "She'll spoil him," she said once. "You don't need to pick him up every time." I smiled politely and ignored the advice. Inside, something stirred, not anger, understanding. She had never been taught that comfort was safe. The distance grew heavier in small, ordinary moments. She forgot important emotional milestones but remembered appointments. She asked about logistics, not feelings. At family gatherings, she praised me for being capable, never for being kind. When I looked tired, she suggested rest, never asked why. Each moment alone meant little. Together, they formed a quiet ache. One weekend, my mother stayed with us. She helped clean, she organized, she cooked. She did everything except connect. When she left, my house felt quieter, but lighter. That realization made me sad. At night, after everyone slept, I thought about my mother, about her childhood, about her rules, about her fears. I wondered how many times she had wanted to say more but didn't know how. I wondered how many times I had done the same. The distance wasn't just hers. I carried part of it too. There were moments when I almost spoke, moments when I wanted to say, "I needed you." I still do, but old habits are powerful. I was afraid of hurting her, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of confirming what I already knew. So I stayed polite, and she stayed reserved. By the time years had passed, the distance felt permanent, not painful every day, but always present. I stopped expecting emotional closeness. But part of me still hoped. That hope made the silence heavier. And then, one ordinary afternoon, something unexpected happened. My mother asked me to come over, just for tea. She didn't explain why. I didn't know then that this was the moment everything would shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. In the next part, I will tell you about the conversation that finally named what had lived between us for so long. The apology I never demanded. And the understanding that changed everything without erasing the distance. When my mother asked me to come over for tea, she did not give a reason. Her voice on the phone was calm, the same as always. No hesitation, no emotion I could recognize as unusual. "Just come by if you have time," she said. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to see her, but because I felt tired in a way that sleep does not fix. tired of conversations that never reached where they needed to go. But something in her tone made me pause, so I said yes. The drive to her house felt longer than usual. I noticed the weather, the gray sky, the way the trees moved slowly in the wind. I didn't know it then, but part of me already understood that this visit would not be like the others. Her house looked the same. The curtains were drawn just enough to let light in without letting the outside feel too close. The furniture was in its usual place. Nothing had changed, and yet something felt different. She greeted me at the door with a small smile. She hugged me briefly, as always. "Tea?" she asked. I nodded. We sat at the kitchen table where I had done homework as a child, where I had learned to sit straight, to answer questions politely. The kettle whistled softly. She poured the water carefully. For a long moment we sat in silence, not the comfortable kind. Not the awkward kind, the waiting kind. She didn't look at me right away when she spoke. "I've been thinking," she said. I waited. She folded her hands together, then unfolded them again. "I wasn't very warm with you," she said quietly. The words landed gently but firmly. I felt my chest tighten, not with pain, with recognition. She went on. "I thought being practical was love," she said. "I thought keeping you strong would protect you." Her voice stayed steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I didn't know how to give comfort. I was never given it myself. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother not as my parent, but as a person shaped by her own fears. She told me about her childhood. About a home where emotions were considered weakness, where children were expected to behave, not feel. "My mother believed love made people soft," she said. "She thought she was preparing us for the world." I listened. I imagined her as a small girl, learning the same lessons I had learned. Learning to be careful, learning to need less. "I thought if I gave you structure, you'd never feel lost," she said. Her voice wavered then. I didn't realize how lonely that could feel. "I'm sorry," she said. Two simple words, not dramatic. Not loud, but honest. "I'm sorry I didn't know how to be what you needed." She finally looked at me then. Her eyes were not pleading. They were open. I felt something loosen inside me. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the rush of emotion I had imagined for years. Instead, I felt calm. "I know," I said. "I know you did the best you could." And I meant it. Forgiveness did not arrive like a wave. It came quietly, like a door opening slowly. I forgave her not because everything was fixed, but because I understood. Understanding softened the edges of the past. We sat there together, sipping tea that had gone cold. No one rushed to fill the silence. For once, silence felt shared. After that conversation, something changed, but not in the way I once imagined. We did not suddenly talk for hours. We did not become emotionally close overnight. The distance did not disappear. What changed was the weight of it. I no longer carried questions without answers. I no longer wondered if she knew. She did, and that mattered. Driving home that day, I felt lighter, but the distance came with me. It no longer felt like rejection. It felt like history. I realized something important. Forgiveness is not a promise that things will become different. It is permission to stop fighting what already is. In the days that followed, I felt a quiet grief. Not for what had happened, but for what never did, the hugs that didn't last, the conversations that never went deep. The comfort I learned to live without, I let myself feel it. I did not blame her. I did not blame myself. I simply acknowledged the loss. After the apology, our interactions softened. She asked more questions, small ones. "How are you managing? Are you tired?" They were simple, but new. I answered honestly without expecting too much. We met where we were, and yet the distance remained, not as a wound. As a boundary. I stopped waiting for her to change in ways she could not. I stopped hoping for a closeness built on emotions she never learned to speak. Instead, I accepted the relationship we were capable of having. There was no dramatic ending to that chapter. No confrontation. No tearful reconciliation. Just a steady, gentle understanding. And that was enough. In the next part, I will tell you how I learned to live peacefully with the distance, how acceptance reshaped my expectations, and how I built a different kind of warmth in my own life, without resentment and without regret. Life did not pause after that afternoon at my mother's kitchen table. There was no clear moment where everything felt finished. Instead, days passed the way they always had. Laundry, work, meals, bedtime routines, but something inside me had shifted. The distance was still there, but it no longer felt sharp. It felt named. When I spoke to my mother after that, I noticed my own voice was softer. Not careful, not guarded, just calm. I no longer listened for what she failed to say. I listened to what she could say, and that made all the difference. The next time I visited her, nothing looked different. The house smelled the same. The furniture stood where it always had. The kitchen table waited patiently. But I felt different sitting there. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, my children, her garden. At one point, she paused and asked, "Are you getting enough rest?" The question surprised me. "Yes," I said, "most days." She nodded, satisfied. It was a small thing, but it felt like a step. I began to understand that love does not always look the way we hope it will. Sometimes it comes wrapped in effort instead of emotion, in responsibility instead of tenderness, in silence instead of words. My mother's love had always been there. It just spoke a language I had to learn slowly. Once I stopped asking her to speak mine, the ache faded. There was a quiet relief in letting go. I stopped waiting for long conversations that never came. I stopped wishing for gestures she didn't understand. I allowed our relationship to be what it was. Stable, polite, genuine in its own way. And in doing so, I found space to breathe. Raising my own children, I became more intentional. I hugged longer. I listened more carefully. I named feelings out loud, not because my mother had failed, but because every generation learns something new. I did not raise my children in opposition to her. I raised them in conversation with the past. I kept what worked. I changed what didn't. As the years passed, my mother softened in quiet ways. She moved more slowly. She laughed a little more easily. She still struggled with emotions, but she tried. Sometimes she reached out awkwardly, a hand on my arm, a question she had never asked before. "How are you holding up?" she said once. I smiled. "I'm okay," I answered. And this time it was enough. There was no dramatic reunion between us. No moment where everything suddenly felt warm and close, and that was all right. Peace does not always arrive with emotion. Sometimes it arrives with acceptance. Forgiveness taught me that understanding is more powerful than blame. It taught me that people give love in the ways they were taught to survive, not always in the ways others need. It taught me that distance can exist without cruelty, and that peace can exist without closeness. The distance between my mother and me never disappeared, but it stopped feeling like a wound. It became a space we both understood. A space that no longer needed to be crossed. In my own home, laughter fills the rooms. Questions are welcomed. Feelings are named, not perfectly, but honestly. I learned that love grows when it is allowed to be spoken. I am grateful for the apology my mother gave me, not because it changed everything, but because it gave us clarity. It allowed me to forgive without erasing the truth, to love without expectation, to accept without resentment. If there is one thing I have learned, it is this: forgiveness is not about fixing the past, it is about freeing the present. Some distances remain, and that does not mean we failed. Sometimes it means we finally understand. Today, when I think of my mother, I no longer feel the ache I once did. I feel compassion. I feel calm. I feel peace. We talk. We sit together. We share what we can. And that is enough. Because love does not have to be loud to be real. And healing does not always close every gap. Sometimes it simply teaches us how to live gently beside them.